With the latest agriculture news from across the state and nation, it's time for the AgNet News Hour from AgNet West. Here's your host, Sabrina Halvorson.
Good morning. Thanks for tuning in to the AgNet News Hour once again. I am Sabrina Halvorson, and joining me on the other mic, Lorrie Boyer.
Good morning, y'all.
So, all right, we sound very happy this morning, but I have read an article that has actually, I have to tell you right out the gate that I have very strong feelings about this. This is not going to be one of those where I remain unbiased. And this deals with a farmer whose land is being taken from him by his local government, and for no other reason than, he hasn't done anything wrong. He's a fifth generation farmer. This is in Virginia. And through eminent domain, they want to take his land to build something else on there. And first off, I have really strong feelings about eminent domain, about the government taking, especially a fifth generation farmer, taking his farmland, his family's farmland, and just, pushing him off the land and saying, it's ours now, you can't have it anymore. I am so irritated by this, Lorrie. I can't even tell you how strongly. To explain how strongly I feel about this would involve a lot of words that I cannot say on the radio.
Well, that's kind of radio, right?
Right.
Yeah. Well, I looked up, just so we know, the official definition of eminent domain. In the United States, it is the power of a state or federal government to take property for public use while requiring just compensation to be given to the owner. So the owner should receive fair market value. And I'm sure you were going to mention this too.
Yeah.
But in most cases, it's really not fair market value.
Right. So this particular case, the farmer's name is Corey Garrett. He's a fifth generation farmer in Carolina County, Virginia. And so he's contesting a local government's attempt to seize his 143 acre riverfront property through eminent domain. Now, the county plans to construct a 14 million gallon per day water intake plant and pipeline on that land, saying that it won't impact his farming operations. Now, he, of course, disputes this, and he highlights that up to 4.63 million gallons daily would serve for industrial cooling, including for data centers. And so he's saying that the project's primary benefit is for commercial interests. It's not really for the community, it's for businesses. And he's emphasizing the land's significance, saying that it's been in his family for 5 generations. And he's also criticizing the county's disregard for alternative solutions and a lack of meaningful communication. He didn't know this was going on until he got a letter in the mail one day saying he had to give up this part of his land. Nobody had contacted him before that. He wasn't part of any discussions. And I want to point out, before we get too far into this, that I originally read about this in an article from Farm Journal, and the reporter's name is Chris Bennett. Chris did just an absolutely fantastic job on this article. I want to give full credit to that. That is where we originally saw this article, and it immediately grabbed my attention because, it's painful to think of a farmer having to give up his land so that businesses can have a cooling center for their data processing.
Imagine you're just doing life, you're doing your thing, and you walk to the mailbox and you get a letter like this out of nowhere. And as you mentioned, there's been very little communication, no discussion, no face-to-face explanations, just a letter. Not only that, but he had 1 week to really decide what he wants to do with this issue, to do with that letter.
Right. And they were only offering him about $7,000 per acre. Now, off the cuff, that may sound like a lot, but when you're talking about fair market value for farmland in this area, that is not fair market value for farmland, $7,000 per acre in that area. So they were really undercutting him. And, when the government is saying, we're going to take your land, we're going to give you pennies on the dollar for what it's worth, and you really don't have much of a choice. Here's 7 days to decide if you're going to fight the government. Gosh, what do you do?
Yeah, what do you do? And to your point, it's riverfront property. I'm sure that it is a pretty penny. But it wasn't like he wasn't using this property. I mean, he bought this, he developed this property. It's a viable piece of farmland for him. This will interrupt what he does with his irrigation, his center pivot. He won't even be able to make a full turn using that pivot or a full circle using that pivot. And also from this article, it looks like even within their own process, city officials aren't really following what they're supposed to do as
No.
far as changing this or converting this farmland as per their own code.
Right, absolutely. Now, I do need to specify he's got many acres for farmland. They are talking about taking 11 acres, not his complete farm.
Okay,
I
that's
just want to make
valid.
sure that
Yeah.
I'm clear on that because
Okay.
the way I stated it earlier, it sounded like it was his whole farm, but they want to take 11 acres. But these are important acres for him. You can't just come in and take out, part of somebody's farmland and say, oh, it's not really going to affect your farm at all. Of course it is. Like you
Right.
were saying, he can't even make, his pivot won't even be able to make a full turn. So he's not even going to be able to operate his pivot because it'll cross the county's right of way. So this will affect him. But the bigger point is, can the government just come and take our land? And, you know, yeah, we have seen this in other situations as well. I know personally, my husband once had a house on a river in North Dakota that the government took through eminent domain. Now, this was just a home, and he had just been living there for a few years, not his family farmland. It did not affect his business at all, nothing like that. But still, it's devastating. And I know that you know of cases in Colorado
Mhm.
that are much bigger than that.
Yeah, so I might throw this in, but one more thing here before I switch over to Colorado. I also like this. There was a lot of people that attended one of the meetings, one of the board meetings that they were deciding on this, and nobody in the audience, nobody agreed with what the city was trying to do in taking the land. And even furthermore, even more insulting is that they voted 6-0 to take his land and insisted there would be no negative impacts to the operation. How,
It's
eh,
absolutely
we'll
nuts.
just take his land. Who cares?
Who cares? There'll
It's,
be no negative impacts for you. So now we are
yeah.
going to talk about Colorado,
Okay.
but I just realized that we do need to take a commercial break. I was so infuriated by this. I forgot we do have to pay the bills. So we're going to take a quick break, then we're going to come back and we will continue talking about, can the government just up and take our land? This is the AgNet News Hour. I'm Sabrina Halvorson. She is Lorrie Boyer, and we will be right back.
Come back to the AgNet News Hour. Here's Sabrina Halvorson.
Welcome back to the AgNet News Hour. We are talking about a case of eminent domain. It started with a case, or discussion started with a case happening out in Virginia, I believe it is. And, but, we were talking about other cases. Now, Lorrie, I know that you know about some issues in Colorado.
Yeah, and I don't have time to get into all the details of this case. It started back in 2023, and there is a pending lawsuit. Big deal for Colorado. And the same type of thing is going on. So the Front Range of Colorado, which is Denver on through Fort Collins North and then down to Colorado Springs South, that whole big corridor is just expanding by leaps and bounds and has been for several years. And it used to be a very good farmland right in the kind of the central part of that Front Range near Brighton, Colorado, which is just outside of Denver. And some of our early farmers came from all over the world to develop this land. And it is a lot of specialty crops, lettuce, broccoli, onions, all those kinds of things in that area, cabbage, all those things. And so what's happening is the city of Brighton wants to build more houses. They want to expand and they need more infrastructure. Therefore, there is this specialty crop farm called Palazzi Farms. And literally, the city wants to use eminent domain so that they can build up the infrastructure, so they can build up the pipes and the sewers and everything needed for these new houses, for this new development. This farm is, oh gosh, I had the number, but I lost it. It's not new. It's very old farm. It's a multi-generational farm. It supplies a lot of the surrounding area with fresh food. They also donate food to food banks and things like that. I mean, they do a lot of good. They keep up the land. They do a great job. They're very water efficient, and they are very mindful of the urban neighbors. So here we have this big city wants to come in and just take their land, and literally almost the same thing using eminent domain, not a lot of processes. It has created public outcry. This has actually made the Denver Post. It's made some national news headlines, all really about what you're talking about, the principality of an entity coming in and taking someone's land. She did get offered what they considered, of course, fair market value. It was nothing, like you said, in the case of Garrett, nothing. And so this fight continues on this land near Brighton, Colorado. It'll be interesting to see what happens here, but it's sad and it's enraging at the same time.
It truly is. I mean, it is so upsetting, the idea that these generational, or like you said, multi-generational farms can just be, thrown away. And, and I understand the need to build more houses. We've got a growing population. Sure, I'm sure there's got to be a balance out there, but this is not it. In my humble opinion, this is not it. Taking land from our farmers,
Hmm.
that's not the answer. We need to figure something else out, and we need to figure it out pretty quickly, because we need our farms, and we need to protect our farms, and we need to protect our family businesses that have been around for generations. We can't just keep carving into them. This original case from Virginia, they had like seven options that they were looking at. Um, and decided, oh, we'll just take this farmland from those seven options. Um, and that's just not okay. Now, I'm going to do something that I don't do a whole lot of, but the Caroline County, Virginia Board of Supervisors is who made this decision, and we talked a little bit about that. But you know what? Um, they have not been able to take, or they have not been open to a lot of public comment. They didn't, it wasn't widely publicized what they were doing, that kind of thing. So, you know, if farmers around the nation want to stand by Corey and his farm, here's a phone number for you. It's area code 804-633-5380, and that'll get you to the Caroline County Board of Supervisors. And maybe we should just let them know how important farmland is, and they can't just keep taking it.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And it's, a lot of these people have put so much of their own money, their own blood, and sweat and tears into these farms just to have them taken away. And it reduces our food supply. It reduces feed for animals that we eat. I mean, there's larger implications on what this will do to our country as far as pipeline food.
Right. Yeah, we need to work out other solutions. So, with that, we are out of time. We have to stop our conversation on this for now, but thank you so much for chatting about it with me, Lori.
Thank you, Sabrina.
This is the AgNet News Hour. I'm Sabrina Halvorson. She's Lori Boyer. She will be back right after the break, and I'll be back later on in the show. This segment is brought to you by Live Earth Products. To get to know a little more about Live Earth Products, we're talking on the phone today with Vice President Russell Taylor. Would you explain a little bit better what fulvic acid is?
Yeah, sure. So when you talk about the humates and humic acid family, you actually have a smaller group, which is the fulvic acids, and they're soluble at all pH. The medium weight molecules are the humic acids, and they're only alkaline soluble. And those are important because let's say you're doing a spray mix and you're mixing something that's somewhat acidic. When you use a humic acid product, that product by definition will gel. It will form precipitate and won't stay soluble. So they can plug emitters, and it is problematic for the applicator. Whereas fulvic acid is soluble at all pH. It's smaller, it's cell permeable, and it really makes a phenomenal foliar applied product. And so for farmers, having access to that ingredient as a standalone ingredient is a benefit because it allows them to use these sprays that are more acidic and not have to worry about gelling and plugging emitters.
And from what I understand, fulvic acid is also being explored for its role in human health. And I'm just curious, how does this intersect with agricultural applications, if at all?
That's the interesting thing about fulvic acid is it's a really great chelating and complexing agent. Nutrients will attach to fulvic acid and it will aid in absorption. So fulvic acid is used in some very unrelated industries such as cosmetics and makeup. So when you look on the label and it says minerals, sometimes that's actually fulvic acid. And what they're trying to do is increase the absorption of those components through the cell membrane. Now, whether it's a plant cell or a human cell, the function is the same, and they're trying to increase absorption. And it's more of a nutritive delivery than it is anything. And that's what we're trying to change the rules for is currently there is allowances for nutritional chemicals that facilitate a nutrient delivery. And it's just not broadly accepted in plants, but we can make those claims in human cells. So same application, but different mechanisms.
To get to know more about Live Earth products, you can visit them online at liveearth.com. That is spelled LIVEARTH.com.
Welcome back to the AgNet News Hour. Here's Lorrie Boyer.
Today, I am talking with Isaiah Kisika, who is with the University of California, Davis. He works in the Biological and Agricultural Engineering Department, specializing in land, air, and water resources. Isaiah, today we will talk about your work and research in groundwater nitrates in the state of California. But first off, tell us more about yourself and your background.
I'm a professor here at the University of California, Davis. And my research, teaching, and extension work focuses on water management in agricultural systems. I help growers use water more efficiently and try to minimize the impact on the environment. There could be groundwater, it could be soil salinization, or any other impacts from irrigated agriculture.
On the groundwater nitrate, is this an actual study that you have been engaged in for a while?
Yes, we've been doing this work. It's actually part of a larger effort, a national effort by the USDA SIP project, where they have monitoring of water quality in what they classify as important or critical watersheds. And our work is responsible for the Central Valley Aquifer System. And we started this work that we just recently published in 2020. That's when the sensors were installed and the monitoring started.
Where at is the work being done? Is it focused on a certain part of the state or is on the whole state?
It is focused on the Central Valley Aquifer System. And we started our work near Esparto in the Sacramento Valley, and we moved on to Modesto. We have a site in Almonds near Modesto, and another site in Citrus near Fresno in Orange Cove.
So how is the study actually being conducted? Are you using technology or going and just doing some old-fashioned digging? How does that look?
We're actually using fairly cutting-edge technology, and that's what makes it exciting. And we are comparing that cutting-edge technology to traditional methods to see how well they agree. So we evaluated 3 methods. One of them is actually what the state of California uses in their regulation of nitrate to groundwater, which is the field scale mass balance. It's sort of like a checkbook. You track all the nitrogen that was applied minus what was removed through crop yield, and what remains is potentially what would be mobilized to groundwater. And then the second method is what has been traditionally used, where you make or you drill groundwater observation wells, and then you go to the well and then pull a sample from the well and test the water quality. The challenge with that method is you see the problem after the fact. The new method we are using, which is called a VEDOS zone monitoring system, is basically you put sensors all the way from the root zone to the groundwater table. And in the site that we recently published, that depth was about 35 feet. And so that allowed us to see the nitrate as it migrated with depth.
How is the nitrate migrating then?
So as you know, nitrate is very mobile because it's very soluble in water. And what was really interesting in our study, we know that nitrate is going to leach. But the conventional wisdom has been that it takes weeks to months to years before you see it in the groundwater. But because of the technology we were able to use, we were able to notice that it actually can reach there in as short as 10 days if you have these very strong atmospheric rivers following very drought years.
How are groundwater managers using the data that you have created at this point?
So I think there are two audiences that this research may inform. One are the growers, and then 2 are the policymakers or the water managers, the water quality coalitions, especially in the Central Valley. For the growers, I think in this era where we are living in climate extremes, because when you have a drought, crops don't grow well, so they don't use the nitrogen as efficiently. So a lot of it gets left in the root zone. And if you follow that with a very wet winter, then there's a high risk of that nitrate moving. So the trick is to try and end the growing season with as little, we call it residual nitrate, as possible. And the way to do that is use advanced techniques like high frequency fertigation, for example. Instead of putting all your nitrogen on as a pre-plant, put on small amounts that are adaptive to what the weather conditions are in the growing season or what your yield potential is going to be. That is hard. It's easier said than done. And one of the things we are working on is to actually develop sensors that measure soil nitrate in real time in the soil, instead of pulling a soil sample and sending it to the lab, which has a lag time, but developing tools that farmers could actually use to make their management easier. The other audience are the water quality boards, or the state water board that's actually responsible for this. The state has adopted a model called the Soil and Water Assessment Tool to assess best management practices and if they are protective of groundwater. But one of the questions that has come up is the accuracy of the model and the validation of the model. So some of the data that we are collecting is being used to improve and validate the model that's used for regulation.
Is there certain agricultural fertilizers or chemicals that have more nitrates that are being used than others?
No, most farmers fairly use the same type of fertilizer across crossing systems, usually associated with cost. Okay. A lot of them use UAN 32 because, it's effective. It's expensive, but it's not as expensive as, say, slow release fertilizers. I'm talking here today with Isaiah Kisica with the University of California, Davis, working in a biological and agricultural engineering department where he specializes in land, air, and water resources. And we'll be right back here on the Ag News Hour. Welcome back as I continue my conversation here today with Isaiah Kisica with the University of California, Davis. He specializes in land, air, and water resources in the Biological and Agricultural Engineering Department. Our conversation is focusing on his work and research with regard to groundwater nitrates. What kinds of crops are you focusing your groundwater nitrate study on? In field cropping system, basically a processing tomato cropping system. So that's where we have most data. We just recently installed systems in almonds and citrus. So I think those results will be forthcoming. But in any farming system, I think if the management is such that you end up with a lot of unused nitrate at the end of the season, you're going to have leaching. I think the key in any cropping system is to manage your nitrate or fertilizers in an adaptive way based on your yield potential. And for example, we say that every crop has what is called a nitrogen removal coefficient, and CDFA publishes all these numbers for the different crops. For processing tomatoes, for example, you remove about 3 pounds per ton of fresh weight. So, and the average yield in California is about 50 tons. But if we have a drought and you have a lot of heat waves, you have a lot of stress, and you only get 30 tons instead of 50. So there's a potentially, if you apply the same fertilizer, there's a potentially a lot of fertilizer that is not going to be removed by the crop and will remain in the soil and will eventually be moved in the environment.
Okay. And what happens? Does it kill the plants or does it provide less yields? Like what happens when there's too many nitrates?
The plant will only use up to what it needs. Okay. And because nitrate is very mobile, when you have water, it's just going to be washed below the root zone.
But then what is the negative about that?
The negative about that is basically just ends up in drinking water sources like groundwater.
I see. Okay.
And
Which is
which
harmful.
is which is harmful to certain parts of the population.
Got it. Okay. All right. Did you collaborate with
And
anyone
the other issue with that is fertilizers are expensive. You really don't want to be flushing money below your root zone.
Yeah, that's a good point for sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Are you collaborating with water districts or municipalities or anyone else on this?
Yeah, we're working closely with the Southern Sun Working Water Coalition. And these are coalitions that you probably are familiar with them. They're helping growers implement best management practices such that they remain compliant with the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program. The Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program is the one that regulates nitrate leaching into groundwater and surface water.
Okay. Anything else to mention here today that I haven't asked about this?
Yeah, I think to me, the biggest takeaway is managing farming is generally going to be more challenging in this era of climate extremes. And any help that growers can get to make their management easier is beneficial to the growers, but also to the broader society.
All right, that makes sense. Okay. All right. Well, Isaiah, I appreciate your time today. Thank you for visiting with me about this.
So, Lorrie, do you have all the answers you need? Sometimes I feel like as scientists, sometimes we ramble on things, but
Well, you didn't ramble. Usually people actually elaborate more than you did. So no, you didn't ramble at all.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at our papers, what was really interesting is you see that when the rains came, you see in the wells, the nitrate shoots beyond, because the drinking water limit is 10 parts per million or 10 grams per liter. But then you see when the rains come after the heavy rains we had in the winter of 22-23, you saw the nitrate in the wells shoot up in a very short time. The site we worked in here in the Sacramento Valley, as you know, we have relatively heavier soils than as compared to farther south, but we still were able to see that. So I suspect if you even had a sandier soil, the risk would be higher.
I want to thank my guest for joining me here on the show today, Isaiah Kasika. He is in the Biological and Agricultural Engineering Department, specializing in land, air, and water resources at the University of California, Davis. I'm Lorrie Boyer, and we are back with Sabrina Halvorson right after this.
This segment is brought to you by Live Earth Products. To get to know a little more about Live Earth Products, we're talking on the phone today with Vice President Russell Taylor. Would you explain a little bit better what fulvic acid is?
Yeah, sure. So when you talk about the humates and humic acid family, you actually have a smaller group, which is the fulvic acids, and they're soluble at all pH. The medium weight molecules are the humic acids, and they're only alkaline soluble. And those are important because let's say you're doing a spray mix and you're mixing something that's somewhat acidic. When you use a humic acid product, that product by definition will gel. It will form precipitate and won't stay soluble. So they can plug emitters, and it is problematic for the applicator. Whereas fulvic acid is soluble at all pH. It's smaller, it's cell permeable, and it really makes a phenomenal foliar applied product. And so for farmers, having access to that ingredient as a standalone ingredient is a benefit because it allows them to use these sprays that are more acidic and not have to worry about gelling and plugging emitters.
And from what I understand, fulvic acid is also being explored for its role in human health. And I'm just curious, how does this intersect with agricultural applications, if at all?
That's the interesting thing about fulvic acid is it's a really great chelating and complexing agent. Nutrients will attach to fulvic acid and it will aid in absorption. So fulvic acid is used in some very unrelated industries such as cosmetics and makeup. So when you look on the label and it says minerals, sometimes that's actually fulvic acid. And what they're trying to do is increase the absorption of those components through the cell membrane. Now, whether it's a plant cell or a human cell, the function is the same, and they're trying to increase absorption. And it's more of a nutritive delivery than it is anything. And that's what we're trying to change the rules for is currently there is allowances for nutritional chemicals that facilitate a nutrient delivery. And it's just not broadly accepted in plants, but we can make those claims in human cells. So same application, but different mechanisms.
To get to know more about Live Earth products, you can visit them online at liveearth.com. That is spelled LIVEARTH.com.
Welcome back to the AgNet News Hour. Here's Sabrina Halvorson.
For this segment, we're looking at some newer technology for agriculture, or at least it's new to being used in agriculture, and that is nuclear energy. So we have joining us a guest on the phone, and James, would you go ahead and please introduce yourself to our listeners?
Hi, Sabrina. I'm James Walker. I'm the CEO of Nano Nuclear Energy. I'm also the head of reactor development for the company.
I wanted to talk today because nuclear energy is becoming more popular in some types of farming. And I wanted to get your take on this, and primarily in vertical farming and in some areas where other things aren't quite as accessible, nuclear energy is becoming more of an option. And from what I understand, you have seen this.
Yeah, so it's not that the company actually started with the intention of partnering with a vertical farm, and obviously very recently we have done that. What actually happened was that because we were creating systems for remote communities, remote locations, the need of that population, it could be all sorts of things. It could be industrial heat, obviously, for applications, but desalination. But one of these things is that when you are bringing remote power to a location of people, typically you need to bring everything to that location. And that can include not just fuel, but it includes food too. So as we began conversations with, say, northern Canadian communities that have to bring in fuel on a daily basis currently, and they were obviously looking for a better supply, a better power supply for more consistent power, you realize that they also bring in food on a daily basis or water on a daily basis, and basically everything they need. And this was something we saw mirrored on island communities, in remote African communities as well. So the potential here is quite enormous, because you could essentially make an independent community, because they could then have power for their accommodations, medical facilities, industry, but also the amount of power that they would for, say, a vertical farm is rather negligible compared with what the reactor can output. The idea that we could bring in food for these communities that have to bring it in on a daily basis almost is a huge thing. And there's tens of thousands of communities across the world that are in this position where food essentially has to be shipped in because the soil might not be good. The conditions might not be great. They might be a bit too remote, and they might not have enough personnel to actually farm their own food. So it became very clear as we began expanding the business that this was potentially a huge market of people that was very interested in having this capability to make their own food.
And what you're talking about, as you were speaking, I kept thinking this could really be life-changing, but it's more than that. Going to have, or has the potential to have, huge effects on communities around the world that otherwise, like you said, don't have a lot of access to food. Now, we're talking about areas that are starting to use more vertical farming because, like you said, maybe they don't have the soil that's needed to grow their food, or even the space that's needed to grow their food. But vertical farming does require power. And now you have provided a solution to that. It's accessible even in remote areas. Am I understanding this correctly?
Yes, absolutely. It is transformative, as you say. One thing I'm quite excited about here is that it has the ability to make a lot of lives a lot better, because as you mentioned, space can be a real issue. When we speak to governments in the Philippines and Indonesia, they may have hundreds of millions of people dotted across hundreds of islands. But in a lot of these locations, it's just not practical to have a lot of farming, because their space is a real commodity, and it's half mountain, your island, and you have to live on the periphery of a mountain. There's no way you can really farm. And the space that's occupied by vertical farming is tiny in comparison with conventional farming, but the limit has always been the power. And so this can unlock a lot of that. And it's not that it couldn't be done with other systems. Like you could effectively do it with a diesel generator, but then you face the same issue of then you need to bring in diesel on a daily basis and power these systems. And if that does lead to intermittent power, that means that your crops won't make it. You need to have a consistent level of power throughout their cycle of growth. So it's actually wonderful to be working on this with Vert2Grow, because I think the human benefit here is enormous.
It absolutely sounds like it could be enormous. You're talking about feeding communities that otherwise have very significant challenges just with getting their food supply. I have a lot of questions, but I'm not the nuclear physicist, so I don't really know how to phrase them.
Oh, no, it's all right. Don't worry. I think most of the questions I ever get asked are not from physicists.
Oh, that's because you guys already understand what you're doing. But I'm curious, what are some of I did a little bit of research before our conversation, and so I'm curious, what are some of the unique advantages of micro reactors? And you've mentioned a few, but to expand on that, these compared to traditional energy sources when we're talking about vertical farming.
So one of the reasons we went into microreactors anyway was that we saw that there was less competition from other energy sources, because with, say, a diesel generator, you can put that anywhere. And so it's not competing against gas or coal or wind or solar or geothermal or hydropower or anything like that. In the locations where diesel is deployed, it's deployed there because there's no other option for other energy sources. For a lot of these communities, you can't run power transmission lines there. That's exorbitantly expensive, prohibitively expensive. And that's the same for gas pipelines. And you might not have the conditions necessary for solar or wind, or the footprint necessary, or the storage systems necessary. And obviously geothermal and hydro fall into the same bracket. You might not have the conditions necessary to utilize those powers. So in those circumstances, and that's very frequent, communities and peoples fall back on diesel. But because you are by definition remote, once you get to that point where you can't utilize anything else, the diesel is often very expensive, and you have to ship it quite a long way to get to these areas which don't have any other alternative. With a microreactor, the benefit here is that you are only competing against a diesel generator, and often the cost of that diesel is very expensive because there's a lot of manpower and logistics involved in bringing power to that location. So as long as a microreactor can beat the cost of diesel over the lifetime of the reactor, it's a more economic solution. So one, it could provide much cheaper power to a community, and two, it's a much more consistent power. So if you can imagine, say, a remote community in Africa or on an island, weather conditions or logistic considerations might impede the ability of the delivery company to get you that power. And that does very frequently lead to power outages. And even in reasonably developed countries too, like we were speaking to the national energy provider of Thailand, and they were very keen on this solution because they do have power outages and power downtimes to a lot of their island communities, even ones with that generate a lot of revenue through tourism. There can be regular expected blackouts. And obviously a microreactor has a very high baseload of power. In fact, the highest baseload of power you can expect from any energy system, including, say, gas or coal or anything like that. So it's more consistent power. It has the ability to be much cheaper. And the other massive benefit too is that a lot of these countries like Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines, they do want to decarbonize, and they do want a cleaner solution for the community because it's still a fairly dirty solution for a lot of these locations. If you can provide energy that's cheaper, more consistent, and less polluting, then obviously you're onto a winner already. And if you suddenly have that surplus of power, then you can do additional things, like you can have vertical farming, you can have desalination, you can have more industry. So you can unlock a lot of human capital, and unlocking human capital can be very energy dependent. If the people don't have power for industry, then they are severely confined. So that's why there's been a big interest in what we're doing.
We're talking with James Walker about nuclear power that can be used for vertical farming. It's a very interesting topic. When we come back, talk about the future of this technology. This is the AgNet News Hour. I'm Sabrina Halvorson, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to the AgNet News Hour. We are talking with James Walker, who is the CEO of Nanonuclear Energy. We're talking about how nuclear energy can be used for farming around the world. And then building on that, looking at the future, do you see maybe expanding the model into other industries or maybe other regions?
Oh, certainly. So we originally, when we started, we were envisaging things like more industry-based, so mining projects, oil and gas, potentially disaster relief areas, things like that. But it began to be quite clear that things like even down to military bases could be serviced by that. In fact, we brought on a former governor of New York that had shipped diesel generators to Puerto Rico after it had been hit by the hurricane. And he was very vocal in saying that if he had the option to use a microreactor, it would have been a much more preferable solution because it's much more consistent power that allows for the expedition to expedite the rebuilding of the community. So obviously that unlocks a lot of potential markets with regard anywhere that's been hit by a natural disaster. Microreactors can conserve that community for rebuilding purposes much more conveniently and practically than a diesel generator. But then as we began to look at things like military bases, we began to realize that there are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of locations serviced by diesel islands and that sort of location. As we began to look at providing industry heat, we began to realize that remote communities were huge. And then that opened up opportunities in, say, northern Canada, where they have a lot of very remote locations where hundreds of these communities ship in everything from diesel to solar, from diesel to food to like clothing supplies, anything you can really think of that you subsist on a daily basis, they have to basically import because there's no resources up there. So, and that was mirrored obviously in Africa because we had an agreement with the Rwandan government to look at providing power solutions for them. And they were very vocal in that only 60% of their population has access to consistent power, which basically means 40% of the country cannot be economic because it does not have the power to establish medical facilities, power for homes, power for industry, or even power for farming and for power for desalination. So unlocking huge parts of, say, African populations and their economic activity, that's enormous. We could probably do that over a number of African countries that suffer from this problem because it's a very old continent and a lot of these communities are very removed from the population centers where power generation is concentrated. I don't want to say it's an infinite market, but it's certainly an enormous market. And I don't know if we'll ever be able to cater to all of it, but certainly we'll start deploying to the areas where the most economic opportunity and the most practical way to utilize this power can be derived.
Thank you so much for taking some time out of your day. I really appreciate that.
All right. Thank you very much for the interview, Sabrina.
All right. That is our show for today. This is the AgNet News Hour. I'm Sabrina Halvorson. On behalf of Lorrie Boyer and myself, thank you for sharing your morning with us.
To get more information on the topics you heard today, visit AgNet West at agnetwest.com. You can also stay connected by following us on our social media at AgNet West on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Also look for Sabrina Halvorson on Facebook and be sure to subscribe to our podcast by searching for AgNet West on your podcast app. Thank you for listening to the AgNet News Hour from AgNet West. AgNet West Radio Network, your primary choice for agriculture news.